All right, go ahead and make your way back to your seat. All right. We have a few announcements to make before we get into diving into the word together. And so, yeah, I'll get into those. First and foremost, we are slowly updating the way in which we are distributing information. You will notice that there haven't been handouts at the door. We are including a lot of our announcements and stuff on online forms. And so in the back, on the offering box, you're going to see a new little QR code thing. It has our logo on it. It says Village Grace. It's called a Porter. And that has a QR code, and that's going to link you to online giving and also to all the events and announcements that we have for the week. We're going to get more of those QR codes scattered throughout in due time. And so that's going to be one of the primary ways in which you can access information. And so that is also going to go out on our weekly email. So if you're not on that, please sign up for that. Some of the announcements for this week is we have 2 concerts that are coming up and 2 really thoughtful, gifted singer-songwriters that are incredible lyricists. The first one is going to be Thomas Austin, and that is on the evening at 7 p.m. of November 8th, so later this week, at the end of this week. The ticket sales, we need to fill some seats, and you would do yourself a favor to experience Thomas Austin. He's a really great singer-songwriter. And then my favorite, John Guerra. There's been few people who have led me into a space of deep worship and contemplation this last season than John Guerra. And it's a really big privilege, I think, to have him here again with us on the 13th. So that's the following week. John Guerra, both at 7 p.m. You can get your tickets online and on the QR code or QR codes that are up here, and also on the weekly email. Second, we have our annual wreath sales. The proceeds for that goes to the Guatemala trip for 2026. This is the last week to order your wreaths. You can do so with the QR code or with this one. It will take you to how you can order those wreaths, so please do that. And then we have this year, Mark Lasitra is going to be leading a Christmas choir, and if that is something you would like to participate in, please email Mark at marklasitra@gmail.com, and Mark, why don't you raise your hand? He's right there. He can get you information for that. It'll be super, super fun. Lastly, and most importantly, so it was brought to our attention that though we did our ordination service several weeks ago, and as part of that, we ordained Christy Thomas, who I have had the privilege of pastoring alongside for the last 4 years, and has been one of the gifts of my ministry life has been the opportunity to learn from, to work alongside, and to experience the fellowship and camaraderie of Christy. And Christy, the elders about a month ago voted to bring Christy on staff, and we failed to announce that to you. That Christy Thomas is one of the pastors here at Village Grace, and you would do yourself a lot of favors knowing Christy Thomas. She is a treasure of a human. She's one of the most gifted pastors that I know, and someone that has brought me into the presence of the Spirit on far more than one occasion. So Christy is going to be sharing with us today and offering the word. So please join me in welcoming our pastor, Christy Thomas.
You should know that I started pastoring with Cameron when he was very much in need of a sabbatical and had been worn out for a number of years. So take what he says with a grain of salt. But it has been a joy to learn from him and to be here with all of you. It's been a wonderful year, a really wild year in many ways. When I think back to January, I don't think I could have envisioned that we would be at this place in November, but it is truly a joy. So today, I'm going to read from Acts 15 as we're continuing our kind of series on common ground. Today, we're talking about community in the sense of accountability and discernment. And so I'm going to start with Acts 15, and it actually starts in verse 1. Well, I guess we're starting in verse 12. That's okay. The whole assembly became silent as they listened to Barnabas and Paul telling about the signs and wonders God had done among the Gentiles through them. When they finished, James spoke up. "Brothers," he said, "listen to me. Simon has described to us how God first intervened to choose a people from his name from the Gentiles. The words of the prophet are in agreement with this, as it is written, 'After this I will return and rebuild David's fallen tent. Its ruins I will rebuild and I will restore it, that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles who bear my name, says the Lord, who does these things, things known from long ago.' It is my judgment, therefore, that we should not make it more difficult for the Gentiles who are turning to God." This is the word of the Lord. So the full chapter gives us this really complicated story and a glimpse of the early church trying to figure things out. And I wonder what it would have looked like to be an elder or an apostle as the message of the gospel was spreading. They had spent this time with Jesus, and they had seen his life and ministry, but they now had the responsibility of leading this growing community. And like any growing community, they were faced with questions about the future. Here we are in this space that has hosted communities of faith for decades, and yet in our current form, we are just 2 months old. We're holding on to the foundations of faith that have guided us in the Christian community for generations as we say the creed each Sunday and we study the word together. And we are also finding our way through the details of how to set things up to go smoothly on Sundays, to work well with our community partners, probably the most community partners I've ever known for a space to share, and meeting our new neighbors. In fact, some of us are sitting next to people that we have just met today for the first time, and others are sitting with people who you've known for years. Just like the early church, we are in a space of having certain things that we've always known, and we're figuring out other things together as they come up. And we're navigating these traditions that we've held onto, and sometimes being asked to examine them in a new light as we come together and we're forging something new. We're having to risk letting go of what has always been and to consider what it might mean to connect to something or someone new. So I really saw this passage as a way that we could have a place of grounding or guidance as we walk through the coming months of discerning our future. As many of you know, our pastors, Andy, Cameron, Diane, and I truly desire to be part of a denomination, as well as the elders, in terms of our long-term kind of road. We want to be part of a community of churches that hold key essentials of faith and harmony. And to find the best fit, we're committed to bringing a team of people into this process. And we also know that as we do this, there may be disagreements and there may be differences of opinions. And so we'll be looking to the early church to see how they handle disagreements. So as I was studying this, I noticed that when there was this difference of opinion on circumcision, they didn't try to figure this out on their own. The question was, should new Gentile believers be expected to complete the same steps as Jewish believers? And Paul and Barnabas disagreed with those who came from Judea. And so they brought the issue to a larger group of elders and apostles. This decision was not made in isolation, but in a community of leaders and believers. It was too big of a decision for one person to consider on their own. It was meant for the community to hold together. And when we think about this disagreement on what was required to profess your faith was a huge issue for the early church. The Jewish community saw circumcision as much more than a physical step of professing your faith. It was a sign of obedience. It was a physical step that demonstrated that you were in right standing with the Lord, that you were willing to shed your old tendency to disobey. And this was more than just the act of one person. It was a step of faith that the community took together and had been committed to. Now, Paul, formerly Saul, would have had a different perspective because he could see both sides of that story. Much of his adult life was spent as a religious leader, persecuting those who stepped out of the religious traditions. But his transformation came through an encounter with the Holy Spirit. His blindness opened him to be able to advocate for those he had once persecuted. And so, to consider this question, this new idea of what it would mean to follow Christ, meant that they had to be committed to a process of communal discernment. This was necessary to have the imagination to consider a new way. To risk doing something against the status quo gives us a window into the character of God. Now, when we think about big decisions, they truly are too heavy for us to carry as individuals. I think as we look out into Portland and our community, we see so many heavy issues in front of us. How are we going to care for the hungry when SNAP benefits are up in the air? How do we look after the stranger or the immigrants, the asylum seekers, the poor in our neighborhoods, the homeless? And it's tempting to want to look to one person to solve the problem. But there's no one person who can find that solution without wisdom and counsel from others. And there's no one person who can carry these problems on their own. The Proverbs remind us that we need each other to make good decisions. In Proverbs 11:14, it says, "For lack of guidance, a nation falls, but victory is won through many advisors." And then later, Proverbs 15:22, "Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. With many counselors, wisdom prevails." And so we are asked to be a community that is willing to submit to one another. And that is a hard ask for most people. We don't practice it very well in our daily lives. Fortunately, when we disagree with someone, it feels easier to just walk away. And it's much harder to ask a community to speak into your decisions about the future. Sometimes it's easier to just make the decision on your own or seek people out who are going to agree with you. But as a church, we are called to walk with each other, not on our own. We are called to live our lives with people who disagree with us and yet are united in our commitment to Christ. We have to be willing to live with others and experience and offer forgiveness. And I have to think that this was not easy for the people who disagreed with Paul and Barnabas to accept that their initial thought on welcoming the Gentiles was not the answer that the elders and the apostles came down with. But they had submitted themselves to the community and to the truth of God's kingdom. We are called to hold on to each other, even in the midst of disagreements. We are called into a community that believes we are all worthy of transformation and redemption, for none of us are perfect. We will all make mistakes, and we need to believe that we can be held in love. This next section is kind of titled Redeeming Accountability. And it's this idea that we will contend or fight for each other to be the fullness of who God created us to be. And, when you've been in church your whole life, there might be certain terms that can take on a deeper meaning, and sometimes those terms are a little painful. And so for me, one of those words is accountability. If you grew up in the 90s or early 2000s or were in youth groups in those times, there was this kind of movement around accountability groups in my communities, where you would have a group or a partner that you would meet with, and you would confess your sin or your struggle in front of these people, and you were committed to praying for each other, which sounds amazing. But often in those groups, there was one missing piece. There wasn't a lot of grace, and there wasn't a lot of forgiveness. Instead of bearing your soul, and kind of being given this sense of forgiveness and love, often it was a prescription of, here's what you should do next. Here's what you need to do more of. Or here's a study. You should really do this one. It's going to help you. And so sometimes I walked away feeling that I was failing as a Christian, that I wasn't meeting God's standard, and that no matter how hard I tried, I just could not get it right. And this redeeming accountability is one where Jesus is trying to help us as a community be a mirror that reflects God's loving gaze back at us. It's a place where we can sit with each other and know that even while someone is struggling, they are made in the image of God, just like we are. And that the gift of the cross is a deeply redeeming love. It doesn't excuse the fact that someone has perhaps acted in a way that has wounded you deeply or has wounded others, but it acknowledges that they can be seen and that they can be loved and that there is grace. Now, one of my first memories of church is centered around the communion table, though growing up we had the little cups and the little wafers that got passed out. And children weren't allowed to take communion until you were baptized. And in my family, that meant you really had to know what it was all about. So it was a teenage decision. So every week I watched the adults pass around the crackers and drink the juice, and I thought it was unfair that they got snacks. And this is the era where Sunday school started at 9:30 and the main service was at 10:30, and I do not remember goldfish. I do not remember graham crackers. I was very hungry because we were not getting out of there till noon. And so one Sunday after church, while all the adults and other families were in the fellowship hall chatting away, my partner in crime, my cousin Susie, and I stayed behind and walked behind each aisle where the little thimbles, kind of communion shot glasses were. We licked the grape juice out of the used cups. Sister Mildred Hembry and her daughter Peggy, who were old when I was 5, and they stayed the same look throughout they were probably my age now, and yet Sister Hembry looked the same from age 50 to age 100. She just never changed. Well, they caught us. And in this community, they did not need to tell our parents what we had done. They did not need to walk us up. They took care of disciplining us themselves. And they could do this because they had been part of our lives since before we were babies. They could speak into us and hold us accountable for our actions. I did not fact check myself, but I have this memory of going into the kitchen and washing all of the thimble glasses that we had licked. I don't know. But Sister Hembry and her daughter Peggy had welcomed my mom as a new immigrant who was 5 months pregnant, moved to the United States, only had her sister, had not told her mother she was pregnant because she knew she wouldn't be allowed to come even though she was married. My aunt had come in 1971, and she had been married for a year, but apart from her husband. My uncle flew to India, got married, and left. She moved in with her mother-in-law for a year and then came to the United States, where this community of women in Springfield, Oregon, hosted a bridal shower and took her and her new husband to California on a family trip for their honeymoon. I don't know how many of you went to Disneyland as a honeymoon with people from church, but that was what their experience was. These women helped these new moms navigate their new lives in a foreign world. They held baby showers. They made us quilts. I still have my high school graduation quilt that the women's ministry women sewed together. They prayed for us each week. And it was in this community that I was taught to how to care for my neighbor and my friends, and also how to receive correction when it was needed. But I knew these actions were completed in love. There's this idea of what it means to be a truth teller in love, and Andy sent me this quote from Paul Waddell as I was preparing. Paul says, "Real friendships are based in truthfulness, not flattery. Anybody can flatter me. Anybody can tell me what I want to hear. But only those who truly care for me are willing to be truthful with me." There is an audacity to friendship, and there should be an audacity to community life, because friends risk speaking the truth to one another. This takes courage. It only works where trust is strong, but is an essential element of friendship, because we cannot want the best for our friends if we stand by and say nothing when we see them developing habits we know will only hurt them. One of my dearest friends is a woman named Cindy. We met the year I graduated from college and shared the upstairs of a little bungalow in Tacoma. And she is gifted in truth-telling. And I have to tell you, that is not always a gift that is celebrated. In our early years, she was fond of clear communication, and I blame it as her training. She was in a graduate program for mental health, and she was really good at diagnosing an issue. She wanted to clearly communicate her feelings on whatever issue she saw in you. And when you happen to be her roommate, whose family did not communicate directly with each other, sometimes I would react in panic and in shame. And one such instance had me calling my cousin in Denver to ask if I could visit that day. Cindy had told me the truth of how I had hurt her feelings, and she felt better. She had gotten things out in the open. She was ready to move on. I spent the night catastrophizing the situation and looked up mileage flights to Denver, waited for the sun to rise, and called because they were an hour ahead. And I literally went to Denver for 36 hours because I couldn't face her. We laugh about this now. We joke that she was a little too quick to cut to the point without anesthesia, and I was a little too quick to run away. But 25 years later, we've just gotten to know each other better, and we've stayed committed to sharing life. Our authenticity means that we can lovingly call each other out on our behaviors. About 14 years ago, before I moved to Portland, she told me that no matter what new thing I jumped into, eventually I was going to have to address the baggage I was carrying with me. She's like, do you notice that you just keep signing up for new things, like that 14-week marathon training program, instead of dealing with whatever God is bringing up in your life? You just keep going and going and going, and you haven't slowed down. And that, her word, was really hard to hear, but it was said with deep love and compassion, and she stayed committed to showing up. And I'm really thankful that we've stayed in each other's lives long enough to have these deeper conversations. I promise it's not one-sided, but I'm not going to share my stories of holding her accountable, because she's not here. There are good ones, though. But you know, authentic relationships are what we're called to step into in our church. We need to know each other well enough to speak into each other's lives. And that happens when we stay connected and develop deep relationships. It takes a level of commitment that's more than just saying hi at coffee hour. And I get it, we all have different stages of life, and sometimes just getting to church on Sunday morning is the best and biggest accomplishment of your day, especially as I look at Sawyer's parents who have 4 children and a 5-week-old, and they made it here, even though they didn't sleep very much last night. But I also want to offer that sometimes it's when life feels most crazy that we desperately need someone to hold our baby or hold our toddler or to sit with us and just let us cry in the middle of a service. A couple weeks ago, I was in my new small group and I realized there were 2 sets of moms who had raised twin boys to adulthood. And that was such an encouragement for me because I have dear friends who go to church here who have twin boys that we have managed to keep alive. And I say that because their first birthday party was a party for the children, and then that night was a party for all of the people in the community who had walked with them. So it means so much to know there are people in this room who can speak into other people's lives and say, hey, I remember this stage. It's okay. It will get better. They will get potty trained. They will be able to sit through a meal. They won't always hit and scream. Or they will start talking more. There are people in our community who have been where we are for some of us and can guide us and help us through. And for those of you who have been through the hard stuff, you might need the reminder of the joy that comes from a child sliding under the pews on a Sunday morning like there was last week. Or having a conversation with a little person where they get to tell you about the wonder that they see in the world. I love experiencing life through the eyes of some of our youngest members. These are the ones that Jesus held close and lifted up. Jesus made time for them. And they have a special way of considering the world that we could miss if we don't pause and consider what brings them joy and what brings them wonder. You know, for many years, my nephew Jack would start it felt like every sentence, can I tell you something? And his simple question would be the beginning of a very long story. Now, he's turned 10 this year, and I know that these conversations are going to become rarer as he becomes a tween, and he's too cool to chat with his Auntie Kiki. But I will never forget, and I will hold on to those moments when I hear him say, can I tell you something? And he just shares whatever random fact he has learned and thinks is so important and so cool. Now, having this authentic truth-telling does mean we have to be open to differences. And so, as truth-tellers in love, we also have to be a place where we can listen to these differences and welcome them and resolve conflicts. Pastoral theologian Margaret Kornfeld describes true community in this way. For communities to function, to hold and support, they must be places where members are able to communicate with each other honestly and without fear, resolve conflicts with each other individually and within the group, learn to love themselves so much that they can love each other and reach out to strangers. Such communities are safe, inclusive, and just. Dr. Shaniqua Walker Barnes says, a hallmark of genuine community is its capacity to appreciate difference, whether that is individual or cultural difference. This means being able to tolerate and resolve conflict in ways that are growth-producing. Tolerating and resolving conflict in ways that are growth-producing is not something we see celebrated in our culture today. As a government teacher, this is a really hard season of explaining government shutdowns to high school students every day. And this idea of tolerating and resolving conflict that leads to growth is even harder when we have to engage with our friends and neighbors and the people we worship with each week. It's so much easier to disagree with someone online who I never have to see, or who's barely an acquaintance. I have seen friends post something, and then some random person that they knew 10, 15 years ago starts fighting, and then other friends start defending, and these people have never had a conversation. They've never even met, but they're going to take time to argue on the internet. It's really a lot harder to be committed to a relationship with someone that you see week to week over dinner, and to be willing to have a curiosity about their experience and their perspective. Are we willing to be shaped by someone else's story? Those individual and cultural differences are ways that the Holy Spirit can invite us to imagine something different. What if our perspectives of God and the kingdom of God are being refined when we sit with those differences? There's a story in the Old Testament that I recently read that I swear I had never really seen before. And I know I've read through Numbers and a Bible in a year or some sort of project, I'm sure. But in Numbers 27, the story of Zelophehad's daughters came up. There were 5 women who they were with Moses. Moses, sorry. The oldest daughter's name is Noah, and that's why I was getting confused. They were wandering through the wilderness, and they were with their family as they were going to the promised land, and their father dies. He had no sons. They were unmarried. And so at that time, they would not have received an inheritance. And they felt this stirring, and they had the courage to ask the elders to be recognized as heirs and to have their father's name continue. This had not been asked before. And so Moses went to God and asked the question, asked God, what should we do? And God gave the inheritance to the daughters. Their courage led the community to a different way of experiencing God's provision and blessing. They helped the community experience God in a new way by sharing their story and sharing their heart. And as we continue to grow together and connect through our common ground, I wonder if we can commit to a sense of curiosity around each other's stories. If we can move beyond our easy connections to grow deeper, to become rooted in each other and in our common faith, can we learn to lean on each other for accountability and discernment? Can we trust that the kingdom of God is calling us to live intentionally and communally in ways that provide diversity, support, love, and connection? None of us can solve all of the problems that we see in front of us, and there's much that we could lament. And yet there is also a joy in knowing that we are part of a community, not just the one that meets here, but the greater faith community in our city, in our state, in our country, in our world, that are seeking the Lord and seeking to be the hands and feet of Jesus. That they would know us by our love, and that would direct what we do. So today, as our communion servers and musicians come up, I'd like to invite us to come to the table and to participate in the act of communion. We have an open table here in the sense that we're not going to stop you from participating or have something that says a statement you need to sign. But I invite you, when you come to the table, to remember that Jesus did this with his disciples at their Last Supper. And we take the broken bread and the juice as a reminder of what Christ has done for us, and as a reminder of what is to come, the fullness of the kingdom of heaven, a kingdom that is full of all different kinds of people who have been redeemed by his love.